Number 1.
Where is little June Robles? The question echoed around Tucson and across the country in the spring of 1934. But she wasn't just missing. A 6-year-old girl who happened to wander off. She'd been kidnapped, snatched from the sidewalk outside her school by someone an eyewitness said was a dirty, emaciated man wearing sunglasses. This spectacular crime gripped Tucson like nothing before or since. Cops blocked every road into and out of town. Rescuers entered homes and literally turned over beds. The post office ordered every mailbox in town searched for ransom notes. Armed volunteers descended on potential hideouts across southern Arizona and Mexico. Then, suddenly, after 19 days of captivity, rescuers responding to a mysterious tip out of Chicago found little June in the desert near Broadway Boulevard and Wilmette Road and returned her, physically unharmed, to her family. The case should have ended there. But how could it? Too many questions remained unanswered. Police never named any good suspects. No trial was held. No ransom was paid. And as time wore on, the few hard facts that existed seemed to melt into a haze of innuendo and whispers. The story blurred so badly that more than 2 years after June's rescue, a grand jury investigation questioned whether a kidnapping had occurred at all. June had just left the Roscrouge School on 5th Street, near Tucson High, around 3 p.m. on Wednesday, April 25th. A beat-up Ford sedan pulled to the curb beside her. Eyewitness Marguerite Smith, who'd just picked up her son, saw the man inside beckon June into the backseat. The child seemed to be saying, "No, no," but the man seemed to be insisting, said Smith, who drove on, unwilling to intrude on what she thought might be a family matter. The kidnapping's second act unfolded later that day on Church Street downtown. A man slipped 25 cents to a boy named Rogelio Estrada, with instructions to deliver a note to June's father at Robles Electric Company. Rogelio handed the note to Fernando Robles at 5 p.m. The kidnappers were demanding $15,000. The letter also included detailed instructions on how to deliver the money and a threat to June's life if its contents were revealed. Fernando penciled a fast reply and gave the note to Rogelio to deliver to the kidnapper. But when the boy returned to the parking lot, across from Robles Electric, the man had vanished. News reports say Fernando feared bringing the cops in, but somehow they found out, and quickly. By nightfall, investigators had begun their work, and the clock on June's imprisonment had started ticking. Tucson in 1934 was still a small desert town, neighborly and peaceful, but it was growing, too, and losing its cherished isolation from the troubles of the outside world. Only 3 months before, police had captured notorious outlaw John Dillinger and his gang in Tucson. They'd rented a house in a quiet neighborhood on 2nd Avenue, posing as ordinary winter visitors. But even after Dillinger, few believed Tucson's streets could hold men capable of taking an innocent girl from her family, threatening to kill her for money. That changed overnight, and outrage fell over the city like a monsoon rain. Heeding a call for help, volunteers streamed to the sheriff's office the morning after the kidnapping. News reports described scores of aroused citizens milling angrily about. Within hours, some 400 men had signed on to help search every house in town. Around noon on the 26th, the kidnappers delivered a second note. This one to Bernard Robles, June's grandfather. It read, "Mr. Robles, child safe. We are willing to reduce the ransom to $10,000 if you act quickly. Child will be returned safely as per your instructions. Obey instructions. Signed Z." The kidnappers' effort to involve Bernard made it likely that he was the real target. Reputed to be one of southern Arizona's wealthiest men, Bernard had come to the United States in 1864. At age 7, from Mexico. He and his mother reportedly crossed the border on burros, their possessions hanging over the animals' backs. Bernard and wife, Jaquina, eventually opened a store in Tucson, and they went on to amass a fortune in ranching and real estate, becoming one of the community's most prominent families. Robles Junction, west of Tucson, is named for them. The local papers jumped on the Bernard Robles angle. They dubbed him a cattle baron and a stately, keen-eyed Spanish aristocrat, and June became an heiress. Reporters also were quick to note a blood tie to Assistant County Attorney Carlos Robles, June's uncle and Fernando's twin brother. Carlos secured an airplane to swoop over the desert in what was being called the greatest manhunt ever staged in the West. The massive publicity produced 100 telephone tips to police the first 5 days. The result was a circus that had cops plunging into abandoned mine shafts and even scouring Colossal Cave, once a hideout for Old West robbers, looking for June. The frenzy drew crazies out from under their rocks. The owner of the Deluxe Cafe near Fort Huachuca reported seeing 2 men armed with a machine gun, a rifle, and a pistol carrying a child. Eva Coleman claimed she saw the men attempt to feed the child an egg in their car, but the child refused the food. Believing the trio might be headed into Mexico, officers swarmed the border area and the remote canyons of the Huachuca Mountains, accompanied by Apache scouts. In huge type, the Arizona Daily Star blared, "Posse pursues bandits with machine guns." But it proved a waste of time. Coleman had made it up. She was arrested. "We have run down clue after clue which has faded into nothing," said Tucson Police Chief Gus Woolard. "I never worked on a case in which we had so little information." Fernando Robles tried his best to contact the kidnappers. The first few nights after his daughter was taken, he stole away from the family home, and following instructions in the first ransom note, drove along one of 3 designated roads on the edge of the city at precisely 9 p.m. If he saw a white string stretched across the road, he was to throw the money out and keep driving. But the Robles family believed the publication of those instructions had scared off the kidnappers. Worst of all, they feared that the sheer enormity of the manhunt might spook the criminals into carrying out their death threat against June. In a public appeal published April 30, Fernando informed the kidnappers that he'd convinced the police to call off their search, and that he was ready to deal. "I do not mean to discredit the officers. God knows they have done everything they could do," Fernando said. "But it has been no use, and only one thing now is left. I must get in touch with these people. I want my baby back." To make sure that he was dealing with the proper parties, and that his daughter was still alive, Fernando asked the kidnappers to send him a piece of June's dress, and he asked for his daughter's answers to several personal questions. But nothing worked. The Robleses remained in seclusion as April ticked down with no new developments in the case, which is beginning to parallel the theft of the Lindbergh child in the East, said the Star. One persistent rumor had it that Dillinger's gang, who'd escaped police custody after their removal from Tucson, had returned and taken little June. Their motive, according to this theory, was revenge against the Tucson police. Upon his capture, Dillinger had angrily referred to them as Hicktown cops. The press latched onto a slightly meatier topic the first days of May, when Bernard Robles made a secret trip across the border to Pitaquito, in the altered district of Sonora. But like everything else in the case, it didn't stay secret long. He went to consult Manuel Gamboa, a psychic said to possess supernatural powers. The kindly seer of Pitaquito, as he was called, attracted Mexicans from miles around seeking help with their problems. He lives in an adobe hut in which is kept his crystal ball, the instrument of prophecy, reported the Tucson Daily Citizen. Bernard spent 2 hours with the seer and kept close counsel when he crossed back into the United States, saying only that he hoped this little journey into Sonora will lead to finding June. For a time, the search focused on Mexico, but that only produced more false hopes. One lead directed authorities to the bottom of a mine shaft in Sonora, where, according to a Mexican agent working the case, police could find June's body. The unending rumors and the dashed hopes compounded the Robles family's pain. June's mother, Helen, was said to be dangerously ill from a nervous condition, and Bernard told reporters, "You have no idea the torture we have suffered. It becomes almost unbearable." The case took another bizarre turn on Monday night, May 7, when authorities received a third ransom note. In it, The kidnappers gave correct answers to Fernando's personal questions and rambled on with threats and questions of their own. Now, if you play dirty, we will play dirty. Your child is okay, keep spies away. Why don't you do as told? You have tried to trap us. We know what you have done. If you had listened to us, your child would be with you. Now down to business. Your child will be released 48 hours after money is delivered. We are going to shoot straight. We will keep our word. Now or never. XYZ. Obey. More disturbing than the letter's content was the manner of its delivery. The kidnappers shoved it, boldly and unbelievably, right under the door of the county attorney's office in the Pima County Courthouse. This forced investigators to speak in whispers in their own offices and peer over their shoulders, suspicious that a criminal's mole might be lurking. The final break in the bizarre case came Monday, May 14th, and it bore out an earlier statement by Jaquina Robles. Amid speculation that the child was in Mexico, the family matriarch made a firm and eerily psychic assertion to the contrary. She is here in Tucson, Arjun. I feel it. It was done by people in Tucson. There are some cruel people that live in the city. She was right on both counts. That day, a mysterious note with a Chicago postmark landed on the desk of Arizona Governor B.B. Moore in Phoenix. It described a desert area on Tucson's east side, where June could be found. Immediately, Moore dispatched a highway patrolman to Tucson, and he rushed to the scene with County Attorney Clarence Houston and his assistant Carlos Robles. But the men weren't optimistic. One chilling sentence in the letter, "You will find the body covered with a load of cactus," led them to believe that June would be dead. The men searched what then was remote desert a mile and a half southeast of St. Joseph's Academy, on Wilmette Road for 2 hours, finding nothing. Robles grew disheartened, believing the tip, like so many others, was a fake. Then he saw a cactus in the shape of a cross, and a lump came to his throat. He knew he was in the right place. "Carlos, go on," he said to himself. "Don't give up." Before long, Robles heard Houston shouting, "Carlos! Carlos!" Houston had nearly tripped over a mound of dirt. After sweeping a side brush, he found June buried alive in an underground cage, one of her ankles chained to a spike. Houston leaned in and said, "Hello, June. Do you know me? Are you afraid of me?" She glanced up, startled. "No, I'm not afraid of you," she said. At the same time, Carlos Robles was bolting toward Houston. "I know I ran into several cacti because my legs are covered with needles," he said. "But I didn't feel any pain. When she came into my arms, I cried like a baby. I was so happy." But his euphoria turned to rage at June's imprisonment. The iron cage was so small she couldn't stand up. In a hard rain, she might have drowned. She got air through nail holes punched in its top, and food shoved through a trapdoor. Her water came from 2 filthy iron cans. Her bathroom consisted of a pot in the ground. Those who saw the cage called it a living tomb. June came out of it filthy and covered with vermin. The shackles had bruised one of her ankles raw, and her skin was blotched from being cooked by the sun beating on the metal box. As the rescuers pulled her from the pit, June stopped them, saying she needed to retrieve her report card. She'd received it the day of the kidnapping, and was eager to show it to her mother. Press reports described her as weak, bewildered and highly nervous. She told police that 2 kidnappers had taken her immediately to the cage after the abduction, and had visited her only 4 times in 19 days. 1 entire week had elapsed between visits, and when the criminals heard her wailing, they ordered her to pipe down, or they'd stab her in the back. Tucson felt palpable shock at news of her treatment. "My big regret is that we have no capital punishment for such a crime," growled Houston. "Brutes they must be," hissed Jaquina. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover put his top assistant in charge of finding the perpetrators, and the public heard all manner of promises about justice. But none came to pass. The cops managed only one arrest, a 31-year-old Tucson dance hall operator, Oscar Buster Robson. They believed his handwriting matched one of the ransom notes. The government's best investigators sweated him mercilessly for months, but their case ultimately collapsed, and Robson was released. As the police fumbled, the Star reported that the story of the torture cell rescue was sweeping the world. according to one London editor, and June acquired the distinction of being interviewed by Transatlantic Telephone for a great English daily. Fernando even considered inking a deal with Hollywood, according to the Associated Press. He had one offer to make movies, and another for June to go on a $1,000 a week vaudeville tour, during which she might reenact the kidnapping for audiences. He planned to set aside $1,500 of the windfall as a reward for the capture of June's kidnappers. Fernando wanted to do that because so many Tucson parents have written me saying they are afraid for the safety of their children because the kidnappers are at large. Press accounts don't say, however, whether any deal was ever finalized. The kidnapping eventually faded from public view, but it scarred the Robles family. The Citizen reported that June's parents, fearing a second abduction, pulled her from public school and enrolled her at Immaculate Heart Academy, where she would be under constant supervision of the sisters. Said Helen Robles, "I simply cannot bear to leave my children alone for a minute." The paper also reported that Burnham, a hard-nosed man who some believe had made enemies in his business dealings, no longer traveled to or from his ranch at night, preferring to remain overnight and return to the city the following morning. "I'm afraid I might be next," he explained. "Because the kidnappers failed to collect the first time, they may try again by taking me." By the sound of it, Burnham remained as confused as everyone else by facts that led absolutely nowhere, except to a trail of baffling questions. Who was the dirty man in sunglasses who grabbed June off the sidewalk that day? Who slipped that ransom note under the county attorney's door? Was there an insider at work? If the kidnappers wanted money, why release June before the ransom was paid? And what was the mysterious Chicago connection? The cops, who spent 32 months trying to answer those questions, promised to tell the public the complete story of the kidnapping, but that never happened. In December 1936, after much anticipation, the federal grand jury dropped a bombshell. Not only did jurors say they lacked evidence to indict anyone, but they labeled the child's baffling disappearance an alleged kidnapping. At that, the feds summarily declared the case closed and walked away. Every scrap of legal paper connected with the grand jury's inquiry was sealed, as is customary when no one is indicted. The last press accounts of the matter carried a tone of high suspicion. The Star said the jurors' use of the word alleged indicated they doubted that the child could have been held in the desert for 19 days, as she claimed, and if she had been, she never could have survived. The paper also said the rumor mill included the charge that the abduction was a frame-up. No one ever explained exactly what that meant. Who was framed and for what purpose? June Robles, the girl at the center of the storm, would be in her mid-70s today. Interview requests left at her husband's Tucson telephone number went unanswered, continuing the stony silence she and her family have maintained since the 1930s. The veil of mystery surrounding one of Arizona's most puzzling dramas remains in place.
Number 2.
Mystery still surrounds the 2008 kidnapping of a pilot who was subjected to an unclaimed $750,000 ransom bid, and whose body has never been found. More than 4 years on, the whereabouts of 26-year-old Robert Wiles is still unknown, despite a workmate recently being found guilty of his manslaughter. His parents, Tom and Pamela, this week revealed for the first time the inside story about their heartbreaking ordeal in a special 48 Hours mystery broadcast on CBS. They told how they received an anonymous note, signed Group X, demanding $750,000 on April 3, 2 days after Robert vanished. They stumped up the cash and tried to drop it off to the supposed abductor, but no one came to claim it. Robert, business development manager and pilot at the Lakeland, Florida branch of Tom's aircraft maintenance firm National Flight Services, was never heard from again. No further demands were made on the ransom, and his body was never found. Speaking of the moment they received the note, Tom said, "I can't imagine anything worse. Somebody has taken one of your children and is threatening to kill him. When I opened the email, it scared the hell out of me. I found the ransom demand from the people who had taken Robert." The note said, "We have Robert. If you hope to see him alive again, you must follow our instructions without deviation. Do not speak about this to anyone, including family." There was a 5-day deadline of April 8, and so, after drafting in the FBI, Tom, who lived in Toledo, Ohio, set off to Florida. He wired the money to a Florida bank with the idea that he would use it as bait to entice the abductor. But officers rejected that plan and filled it with coffee that weighed the same amount as the cash. They placed the box, as demanded, in Robert's office. A secret camera was set up to record what happened, and armed SWAT teams hid close by. But no one ever came to collect the loot. It was during this time the FBI turned its attention to Tom, who had separated from Pamela some years earlier, and had just reached a deal where she would receive $750,000. FBI Special Agent Jim Busnell told 48 Hours Mystery this information led him to believe that the author of the ransom note was very close to this businesses. Tom said he felt, during that time, like a suspect. He said, "They treated me like one. I was grilled a number of times. I was very angry. You know, how could you possibly be looking at me?" Pamela was also under the spotlight, as was former colleague mechanic Steve Lindsay, who had been sacked because of a drink problem. No one could understand how Robert, a star athlete in great physical condition who was a keen boater and fisherman, and had spent years in military academies, could have vanished so suddenly. Tom and Pamela, becoming increasingly desperate, offered a $250,000 reward on national television, and followed up on tips from psychics, who claimed to know the location of their son. Then came the bombshell, from his barber Janie Bear, that Wiles could still be alive. She said he once told her he was frustrated with his life. She said Robert had learned his father carried a kidnapping insurance policy, and ended their conversation by saying, "Please don't tell anybody I told you all this is." But family members say Robert would never be that selfish, and the investigation took another turn as officers spoke to Joel Valle, the owner of another airplane engine repair business. The pair had been together the day before his disappearance, and had come up with a plan to partner their firms with Steve Lindsay to play a key role. Everything was in place, but Tom, who had previously sacked Lindsay, vetoed the proposals. Lindsay went on the run. In desperation, FBI agents obtained detailed call records of the location of Robert's mobile phone calls, and, in turn, CCTV footage of the various toll booths on the Polk Parkway, where a call was made from. Tom was drafted in to look at the tapes, and quickly spotted the car of Toby Holt, his 42-year-old operations manager, who passed through the toll booth with his right arm and hand close to his ear. But, according to Holt's own phone records, his mobile was not in use as he went through the toll. He then became a prime suspect, was called in for questioning, and could not provide an alibi for his whereabouts that evening. The FBI discovered he had several mistresses, outside his marriage to wife Beverly, but there was no DNA, blood or forensic proof to link him to the crime. The trail had gone cold. Then, in March 2009, the FBI called in reinforcements to systematically go back over the case. They soon realized that Toby Holt's phone and Robert Wiles' phones were seemingly synchronized, meaning that, in the toll booth photograph, Holt was using Wiles' phone. Busnell said, "When you put them together, the pieces of the puzzle, it's a very strong circumstantial case." Holt was arrested on December 18, 2009, at Orlando International Airport, after a flight from Bogota, Colombia. Toby Holt, whose real first name is Staubert, denied the charges of extortion, kidnapping and murder of Robert Wiles, and languished in a Florida jail for 2 years. Then, in January 2012, he stood trial. Defense lawyers said there was no evidence and pointed the finger at Steve Lindsay, who in fact died of lung cancer in 2009. But prosecutors said that too many coincidences is not a coincidence, and that Holt's unexplained whereabouts for over 4 hours the night Robert disappeared was key. They also said Holt repeatedly used Wiles' phone, even using it to send the ransom demand to his father. Holt was found guilty of manslaughter and is currently scheduled for release in 2039, when he will be 72 years old. He is appealing his conviction based on insufficient evidence. Tom Wiles told the court following the verdict, "Keep this man off the street, and maybe somehow, somewhere he'll decide to tell us where. What he did with Robert. We have a son. We don't know where he is. We want to bring him home. I want to know where my son is." Pamela added, "I'd give anything to hear him again. Just to touch him again."
Number 3.
when bones washed up on the shores of Lake Michigan near Manitowoc in 1947. Folks speculated that the bones might be a clue to a mystery that had been unfolding since the beginning of May of that year. They were wrong as it turned out. The bones weren't even human, but it showed how prominent the following story was and how far it had spread. The story began months earlier and over 140 miles away from where the bones washed up. It started on a rainy day near Lake Ripley, Wisconsin. The fact that it was raining on that May 1st, 1947, played a big part in what happened later that day. The Weckler family was well known in the Oakland Center area. In fact, George and his wife, Eleanor, were known throughout all of Jefferson County. George's family lived on the same land for over 100 years, and he was very involved in the community. George and Eleanor had served their little community in many capacities throughout the years, and each of those positions had increased folks' respect of the Weckler family. May was always a busy month in a farming community, and May 1947 was no different. That May 1st on rainy and chilly. The fact that it was raining changed the regular routine in the Weckler household. The three younger children attended the Oakland Center Rural School. The school was about a mile down the road from the Weckler home. Usually, 12-year-old Laverne, 10-year-old Joanne and 8-year-old Georgia Jean rode their bikes to the school. But since the rain was coming down in sheets, Eleanor drove the children that morning. Georgia Jean was in the 3rd grade, and for some reason her class was dismissed much earlier than the older classes that day. The mother of one of Georgia Jean's classmates offered her a ride home. It was about 3:30 when Georgia Jean was left at the end of her driveway. The little girl had chatted all the way home about picking flowers for a May basket for the family's front door. Mrs. Carol Flork smiled to herself as she watched Georgia Jean stop at the mailbox and then begin to skip down the driveway. The Wecklers' large house set back about a half-mile from Highway 12, and Mrs. Flork stated that she always left the little girl off at that particular spot when she gave her a ride. Back in 1947, most folks wouldn't have thought about what might happen to a young child in a half-a-mile stretch of road. Inside the Weckler home, Eleanor had no reason to feel alarmed. The children always came home together, and Laverne was very protective of his little sisters. Even after Laverne and Joan arrived at the house without Georgia Jean, Eleanor wasn't worried. She thought that maybe her husband had seen Georgia Jean on his way into town and decided to take the little girl along. When George came home alone at 6 o'clock that evening, Eleanor began to panic. She called some of the neighbors to see if anyone had spotted Georgia Jean after school. Mrs. Flork told Eleanor that she had dropped Georgia Jean off at the end of the driveway. She mentioned that Georgia Jean had picked up the mail and was excited to pick flowers for the May basket she intended to create. The sun was starting to set as the family began to search the woods around the home. Eleanor called some of their closest neighbors to assist. Georgia Jean spent many hours playing in the woods with her siblings, so no one thought she had gotten lost. Their initial fear was that she had fallen or hurt herself somehow. By the time full darkness had settled over the farm, the woods were full of searchers. After a couple of hours without any success, George decided they needed to get the police involved. He had served as a deputy sheriff for years and still had many friends on the force. By the next morning, the word about the missing girl had spread throughout the county. Hundreds of people came from miles around to lend a hand. Policemen from neighboring towns joined in, and soon people were walking shoulder to shoulder through the woods, looking for some clue of the little girl. By the end of that first full day, most of the men involved in the search knew that this was not a case of a missing child. Later the next day, a truck driver confirmed their worst fears. The driver told the police that he had been driving on Highway 12 about the same time that Georgia Jean had been dropped off. He spotted a dark car pulled off the side of the road not far from the driveway to the Weckler home. Just as the truck driver was about to pass the car, it suddenly pulled out in front of him and turned into the driveway. The driver had to swerve to avoid hitting the car. He turned back to yell out the window and saw a young girl skipping down the road. It was the last confirmed sighting of Georgia Jean. When the authorities shared their theory that Georgia Jean had been taken, They promised that they would do everything they could to bring her back to them. George went on a Chicago radio station to plead for his daughter's safe return. The police and the radio station donated money for a reward. The reward quickly grew to over $10,000. The police spread to talk to everyone about the car that the truck driver had spotted. Several people thought they had seen the car driven by the same young man. Fear spread throughout the community. Schools around the immediate area closed down, while everyone waited for Georgia Jean's safe return. The newspapers interviewed her teacher, Mrs. Miller. She described Georgia Jean as a caring, smart little girl. She also spoke of Georgia Jean being quite the artist. Several newspapers printed the hand-drawn pieces of artwork. The little girl loved to draw pictures of her mother and father and the large farm. Years later, when folks remembered this story, they spoke of the connection they felt with Georgia Jean's family. They spoke of the amazing strength George showed as he traveled the county speaking to people to help find his daughter. The family was so touched that many people reached out to help them. Even as hundreds of people walked the wooded areas in the county, others showed up at the Weckler home. The men brought their tractors, and the women brought home baked food. They cleared and planted the fields, so that George and Eleanor could spend their energy on searching for their lost little girl. Others sheared the sheep and repaired fences for the family. The little girl's disappearance eventually faded from the front page, even as George and Eleanor worked to keep people looking for their daughter. Days turned into weeks and then months without any sign of the little girl. Finally, in December, word came that there had been a confession. District Attorney Francis Garrity of Jefferson County told reporters that a Richland Center man had confessed to taking Georgia Jean. Buford Sennett was only 22 in 1947 when the story broke, but his name was well known to authorities. In November, Sennett and his accomplice, Robert Winslow, had kidnapped Carl Carlson and a female relative in Madison. They murdered Carlson and dumped his body into the Wisconsin River, where he was later recovered. It took only 90 hours from the time that they kidnapped Carl for them to be standing in front of a judge. They were both given life sentences and sent to Waupun. Sennett confessed that he and another man had taken Georgia Jean because they knew her father was well off. The plan was to return the little girl when the ransom was paid. They held the little girl in the woods outside of Richland Center. Sennett testified that he gave the little girl 2 sleeping pills before he left for town. He had a date that night back in Richland Center. When he returned in the morning, the little girl was dead. The accomplice, who went unidentified, had given her more of the pills. Sennett stated that they weighed Georgia Jean's body down with cinder blocks and tossed her from the Blue River Bridge near where they had left Carlson's body. Though many hours were spent searching the area, no body was ever found. Sennett quickly recanted the confession. While some folks believed that Buford Sennett had taken little Georgia Jean, others didn't believe the story at all. The months passed, and there was no concrete evidence to tie Sennett to Georgia Jean's kidnapping. Every time a new lead would be revealed, the Wecklers hoped that they would finally learn the truth of what happened that rainy May day in 1947. Every time bones were discovered anywhere in Wisconsin, the family would wait to see if they could finally bring the little girl home. Unfortunately, no trace of Georgia Jean was ever found. In a further twist to this strange story, Edward Gine was questioned about Georgia Jean's disappearance when he was arrested in November of 1957. No connection between Gine and Georgia Jean was ever found. This story was reported in papers all over the country. Many man-hours were spent running down every clue, but to this day, no solid evidence has ever been found. George, a quiet farmer, was forced into the spotlight time and again in order to keep Georgia Jean's story alive. He believed to his dying day that Georgia Jean was alive somewhere. Eleanor carried the agonizing loss of her daughter with her until her death in 1996. Georgia Jean's name was listed on George and Eleanor's tombstone in the quiet cemetery where all of the Weckler family was laid to rest close to their family home. It has been 72 years since the day that Georgia Jean was last seen skipping down her driveway, but folks haven't forgotten the tragedy of the Weckler family. On the 70th anniversary, the news broke that a new cold case task force was looking into the story. Detective Lee Myers took the case over and was hopeful that she could finally prove that Buford Sennett did in fact kidnap and kill Georgia Jean. Myers also hopes that she can find the little girl and lay her to rest in the same cemetery where generations of her family are buried.
Number 4.
For decades, Danny Goldman's kidnapping remained a cold case, thanks to the determination of a group of individuals. However, the mystery was finally solved 55 years after the incident took place, and it finally gave the residents of Surfside, Florida, the answers they've been looking for. Daniel Jess Goldman, known as Danny, was just a day shy of his 18th birthday when he was abducted at gunpoint from his home in the town of Surfside on March 28, 1966. His parents, Aaron and Sally, said that an unknown individual entered their home through the sliding glass doors at approximately 4:30 a.m., expecting to find $10,000, as reported by Surfside Kidnapping. The Goldmans didn't have that amount of money in the home at that time, and the intruder decided to take their son instead. "I'm going to hold Danny for security for the money. I wanted $10,000. But with the help I'll need now, it will double. You get up $25,000. If you don't get it for tonight, the price will double tomorrow," the intruder said. The Goldmans were told to wait for instructions at about 6 p.m. that same day. Danny Goldman was a senior at Miami Beach Senior High, and he had a keen interest in electronics. He spent his free time tinkering with televisions, or being with his girlfriend Sharon Lloyd. His mother Sally worked as an interior designer, while his father Aaron was a prominent builder and contractor in the area. Via Surfside Kidnapping, Danny had made plans with his mother to go and register at the Selective Service office on the day of his birthday. According to the Charley Project, the intruder called the Goldmans by their first names when he demanded money. Since they didn't have cash, they offered to write him a check, but he refused. He then used cords to tie Sally and Aaron's hands behind their backs and secured a knife and scissors on the knots to prevent them from struggling. The intruder then woke Danny and bound him as well before driving off in the teenager's car, a white Nash Rambler. The Goldmans immediately contacted authorities, and they described the abductor as a Caucasian male in his 50s. No other items were touched in the home. The Goldmans prepared the ransom money to get their son Danny back. However, the call nor any other type of contact from the abductor never came. News reporters flocked to the Goldman home, and Aaron made a statement to the media in hopes of getting the kidnapper's attention. "I will deliver the ransom to the location the kidnapper directed. We would indeed be foolish not to work with him in our own interest," he said per CBS Miami. But days, weeks, and years passed without a word from the abductor. The only clues found were Danny's car, which was abandoned at a parking lot, and the tip of a surgical glove that may have been torn off from the kidnapper's hand as he bound the Goldmans, as reported by the Charley Project. The source of the glove was traced, and it was exclusively sold in Canada. It was looked into further, but nothing came of it. Goldman's case turned cold, and law enforcement shelved it and categorized it as administratively closed. The Goldmans both passed away, Aaron in 2010 and Sally in 2012, not knowing what happened to their son. Without Aaron and Sally Goldman gone, it seemed that Surfside residents wouldn't get the answer to the decades-long mystery that has plagued their town. That all changed in March 2012, when 5 Surfside residents decided to take matters into their own hands and seek justice for Danny Goldman, as reported by Surfside Kidnapping. Harvey Lisker, David and Joseph Grobert, Anthony Blate, and former Surfside Mayor Paul Novak looked into the details of the case in hopes of getting an answer. 4 of the 5 mentioned attended the same school as Goldman, and 3 of them personally knew him. "We did a deep dive into every detail, every person, every event. We did not limit ourselves to Danny's case. We looked at the entire context of the times," Novak said in an interview with Oxygen. Each member of the group voluntarily dedicated their time going through pieces of evidence and crucial information. "It was like a humongous onion. You just had to keep peeling and peeling to get to the center," said Novak via NBC Miami. When Sally died, she left a box of documents containing details of Danny's case. Novak and the team went through them, and with the help of friends and former cops, they were able to piece together the events behind Danny's kidnapping. One of the clues in the kidnapping was the fact that the intruder called the Goldmans by their first names which led many to believe that the family was targeted. It was discovered that just months before Danny Goldman was abducted, his father had meetings with the FBI. Aaron Goldman was a board member of a local bank, and he reported fraudulent banking activities that prompted a federal investigation, as reported by NBC Miami. In the late 1950s, banks in Miami were utilized by crime syndicates to conceal and launder money. Suspicious cash flow was observed in accounts owned by associates of high-profile individuals, including Santo Trafficante Jr., pictured above, the boss of the Trafficante crime family, also known as the Tampa Mafia. A total of 19 bank officials were indicted for federal fraud, and Aaron testified against them just 2 days before Danny's abduction. It was concluded that Danny's kidnapping was done in retaliation against Aaron's testimony. According to Surfside Kidnapping, the group of volunteers approached the cold case unit regarding their findings, and it was discovered that Danny's case had links to other cold cases. Corruption was also rampant in law enforcement at that time, and it is believed that Danny's case was never solved because of a cover-up. One of the cold case unit detectives who worked on Danny Goldman's case was able to identify a man named George DeFaze as the abductor. DeFaze matched the description that Aaron provided after the incident, and DeFaze was also associated with the Trafficante crime family. As reported by NBC Miami, DeFaze was also identified by his distinct gait because of a disability. Investigators believe that Danny was killed and his body was discarded within a day or 2 days after he was taken from his home. DeFaze died at a nursing home in 1980, and the Miami-Dade police officially declared Danny's case solved on December 28, 2021. Paul Novak said he wished the case was closed sooner, so that DeFaze could have been arrested for the crime. Since we can't do that, we still find it extremely important to expose the truth, expose the guilty, the culpable, and open doors that have been locked for 6 decades, he told Oxygen. Novak and the other volunteers are open to investigating other cases that have never been solved.
Number 5.
On a summer afternoon 50 years ago, Virginia Piper was trimming pansies at her Orono home when housekeepers alerted her to 2 masked men entering the home with guns in both their hands. They tied up the 2 cleaners, handcuffed 49-year-old Piper, and asked the whereabouts of her old man, husband Harry, Bobby Piper Jr., chief executive at the Minneapolis brokerage firm of Piper, Jaffray and Hopwood. When she told them he was at the office, one of them said, "Okay, Mrs. Piper, you're coming with us." Handing her one of her own pillowcases, they ordered Ginny Piper to cover her head and lie down in the backseat of a green coupe. Before driving off, they left a typed ransom note for $1 million, the most expensive demand the FBI had ever seen up until that day, July 27, 1972. The next day, handcuffed, wet, shivering, and chained to a tree more than 150 miles away in the North Woods at Jay Cook State Park, Ginny figured that nobody would ever find me again. But her husband had come up with the cash, $50,020 bills stuffed into a canvas duffel weighing 110 pounds. Driving alone and without surveillance, Bobby followed a series of notes left by the kidnappers for 2 hours, ultimately leaving the ransom money in a car trunk behind the Sportsman's Retreat bar north of downtown Minneapolis. About 1 p.m. on Saturday, 48 hours into her harrowing abduction, Ginny heard a car door slam and yelled out, "Help!" The kidnappers had revealed her location to a Plymouth pastor, who called the FBI. 5 agents came running through the underbrush, Ginny told reporters the next day. "I've never been so glad to see people as I was to see them." The oldest of the Pipers' 3 children, 78-year-old Harry Piper III, said in a recent email from his home in Oregon, "My mother was a very special and very brave woman, who probably saved her own life. By engaging her captors in conversation, I know now that the FBI at the time assumed she would be killed." Ginny Piper, who died in 1988 from pancreatic cancer at 65, would be 100 this November. In some ways, her abduction was a story with a happy ending, but also one that left 2 nagging questions unanswered. Who were the kidnappers? And what happened to all that ransom money? "I just want to know who did it," said son David Piper, 68, of Minneapolis, who was still living at home in 1972. He said his mother later suffered from what we today call post-traumatic stress disorder. The kidnapping was a devastating event that impacted our family for a long time, David said. It still lingers, especially since there is no certainty as to who did it. Only about $4,000 worth of the ransom's $20 bills turned up at banks in Owatonna, Rochester, Austin, Casson, and Dodge Center. That leaves $996,000 still unaccounted for, a big number that caught people's attention. Mine included, Pine County Attorney Reese Fredrickson said recently. Pine County, about halfway between Orono and Cook State Park, was the home of Donald Floyd Larson, one of the two men convicted of the abduction, and then acquitted after an appeal prompted a second trial. Fredrickson said there's no active investigation. But who doesn't love a mystery? DNA can't solve the puzzle, because two key pieces of evidence were destroyed. Larson's alleged fingerprint on a scrap of paper found in the woods near Piper, and a single hair belonging to the other suspect, Kenneth James Callahan. With DNA, David Piper said, it would be a whole different ballgame. Among the experts on the case is Minneapolis crime writer William Swanson, who wrote a riveting 2015 book, Stolen from the Garden: The Kidnapping of Virginia Piper, Tinyurl.com. Swanson Piper. Many persons familiar with the case believe the job was too sophisticated for the likes of Callahan and Larson, said Swanson, who described the pair as minor career criminals. Callahan suffered a fatal heart attack at age 79 in 2004, after working for years as a carpenter in Cumberland, Wisconsin. And Larson died at 82 in 2008 at the state prison in Oak Park Heights. He was Minnesota's oldest prisoner at the time, serving a life sentence for killing his wife Ruth, her lover, and 3 children in rural Pine County, 4 years after Piper's abduction. Were those murders part of a jealous rage, fueled by catching his friend in an affair with his wife? Or was Ruth the one who wrote the ransom notes, as some investigators theorize, and was about to talk to the FBI? It seems preposterous to me that Larson would kill 5 people to avoid a kidnap charge, when the penalty for murder was much longer than kidnapping, Swanson said. Fredrickson thinks Larson might have been involved, though not the mastermind pulling the strings. As far as the legal system is concerned, no way did they solve that case. Bruce Hartigan, one of Larson's lawyers, said 10 years after the abduction, "We've got 2 or 3 people running around out there who pulled off the biggest kidnapping in history."